The invitation, if one could call it that, arrived not as a piece of cardstock, but as a cold, sterile email. The subject line was simply, Leo's birthday. It was from my ex-wife Veronica. Ethan, it began. Her use of my full name a familiar, formal distancing tactic. As you know, Leo's 10th birthday is this Saturday. Richard and I are throwing him a proper party at the country club. The theme is young investor, very cute. Given the circumstances, and to avoid any awkwardness for Leo, we feel it's best if you don't attend. Richard has arranged for a magician and a stock market simulation game for the boys, and your presence would just complicate the dynamic. You can drop off your gift at the front desk with the concierge. They'll make sure he gets it. All the best, Veronica. I read the email 3 times. Each word was a carefully polished stone, chosen for its weight and its ability to inflict a smooth, deep bruise. Proper party. Young investor. Richard and I. Avoid any awkwardness. The entire message was a masterclass in erasure. It was designed to politely, surgically, and completely remove me from my own son's life, framing it as a thoughtful gesture done for his own good. I sat back in my leather office chair, the scent of old paper and drafting ink filling the air around me. I felt the initial, hot sting of anger, but it was quickly subsumed by something colder, heavier, and far more useful. Analysis. My name is Ethan Hayes, 48 years old, and for 25 years, I have been a professional land surveyor and cartographer. My life is one of precision, of boundaries, of historical records, and immutable truths. I deal in deeds, easements, and the ghosts of long-dead property owners, whose handwritten lines on a faded map can still dictate the course of a multi-million-dollar development. I find the old iron pins hidden under a century of overgrowth. I prove, with mathematical certainty, where one person's claim ends and another's begins. My marriage to Veronica had been a long, slow lesson in the importance of clearly defined boundaries. She saw my work as a dusty, irrelevant hobby. You're always living in the past, Ethan, she used to say, waving a dismissive hand at my drafting table. Deeds and maps. So tedious. The future is in the deal, the connection, the brand. Her brand had improved significantly 2 years ago, when she'd left me for Richard Sterling, a man whose entire personality was a collection of expensive brands. Richard was a property developer, a man who saw land not as a piece of history, but as a blank canvas for his own ego. He bulldozed, he built, and he profited. He and Veronica were a perfect match. They saw me as a relic, a piece of the past they had successfully shed. A quiet, methodical man they could easily manage. They underestimated me. It's a common mistake people make. They see my quiet nature and assume it's a lack of passion. They see my methodical work and assume it's a lack of imagination. They don't understand that my work has taught me that the most devastating truths are often the quietest ones, hidden in plain sight in a dusty archive, or an overlooked footnote on a 100-year-old map. They didn't want me at the party. They wanted my gift, a token of my continued irrelevance, to be left at the door like an offering. Very well, I would send a gift. One gift. It would be a gift that spoke my language, the language of maps, of boundaries, of history, the language of cold, hard, and legally binding truth. A few months ago, at a tense school event, handover, I had listened to Veronica and Richard brag endlessly about their latest acquisition, a magnificent 100-acre parcel of rolling hills just outside the city. It was to be the site of their new home, a monument to their success, a place where Leo would grow up, surrounded by their brand of proper living. They had already sunk millions into the land and the initial designs. The gift I would send would be for Leo, a beautiful, hand-drawn, custom map of his new home, a piece of art, a family heirloom, but it would be the most accurate map ever made of that piece of land. It would show every contour, every stream, every ancient oak tree, and it would show a boundary they had overlooked, a boundary that had been waiting patiently in the dust for someone like me to find it. I stood up and walked over to my drafting table. I pulled out a fresh sheet of heavy, Archival vellum. My work had just begun. This wasn't about revenge. It was about precision. It was about restoring a boundary that had been violated, and I am a master of my craft. My investigation began not in a dusty archive, but in the clean digital world of the county's geographic information system. The GIS portal was a public resource, a layered digital map showing property lines, tax assessments, zoning and topography. I called up the parcel number for the 100-acre lot Richard Sterling had purchased. The digital lines were clean, the survey according to the modern record, it was a perfect, unencumbered piece of prime real estate. But I knew that modern records are only the top layer of soil. The real history, the real truth of a piece of land, lies in the layers beneath. My parents had lived a life of quiet stability, but Veronica and Richard were all about the grand gesture. A flashback hit me, unbidden. It was from Leo's 8th birthday, 2 years before the divorce. Veronica had insisted on a huge party with a petting zoo and a bouncy castle that was bigger than my first apartment. I had suggested a quiet camping trip, just the three of us, something Leo had been asking for. Don't be ridiculous, Ethan, she'd scoff. A child's birthday is an opportunity to build his social standing. Camping is what poor people do. I saw now that she wasn't just planning parties, she was running a campaign to shape my son into a reflection of her values, and to frame me as the obstacle to his proper upbringing. This young investor party was the logical next step in that campaign. My gift would be a quiet counter-argument. It would be a lesson, not in stocks and bonds, but in due diligence. My work as a surveyor has always been part history, part detective work. I started by tracing the deed history backward. The current deed was from Sterling Development LLC. The previous owner was a holding company, which had bought it from a consortium of smaller landowners. I went back, deed by deed, name by name for 150 years. I built a family tree of the land itself. My home office, usually a place of calm, focused work, became my command center. The walls were soon covered with printouts of old deeds, census records, and probate documents. I was looking for a name, an anomaly, a whisper of something out of place. After 3 days of this, I found the first thread. It was in a handwritten deed from the land. Then a 500-acre farm was being sold by one family to another. In the description of the property lines, written in elegant, looping cursive, was a single cryptic phrase, thence north along the old stone wall to the oak tree, accepting the small plot known as Pioneer's Rest. Accepting, that word was a flare in the dark. It meant a small portion of the land was being excluded from the sale. A title search on Pioneer's Rest yielded nothing. It was a local name, not a legal one. It didn't appear on any subsequent deed. Over the next century, as the large farm was subdivided and sold off, the memory of that exception was lost. The small plot was simply absorbed into the larger whole, its legal distinction forgotten. But a forgotten boundary is not the same as an extinguished one. In the world of property law, old exceptions can be like dormant volcanoes. They can lie quiet for a century, and then erupt with devastating force. I knew I had to go to the source. The county records office was a place I knew well. It was a library of land, a quiet building filled with the ghosts of forgotten agreements. I bypassed the modern, digitized records, and went straight to the sub-basement, to the archives. This was where the real history lived, in massive, leather-bound plat books and tin map tubes. The air was thick with the scent of aging paper and binder's glue. To me, it was the smell of discovery. I spent 2 full days, surrounded by the ghosts of my county. I unrolled maps, so old they cracked at the edges. I deciphered the spidery handwriting of long-dead surveyors. I was looking for a map that corresponded to that 1888 deed. A map that might show the location of Pioneer's Rest. Late on the second day, I found it. It was a hand-drawn plat map from the 1870s, tucked inside a larger book of farm survey. It was a beautiful piece of work, drawn with a level of care and precision that I, as a fellow craftsman, deeply admired. And there in the northeastern quadrant of the old farm, was a small square plot, marked off with a dotted line. Inside the square, the surveyor had drawn a series of small crosses, and next to it, in tiny perfect script, were the words, Pioneers Rest, Est, 12 graves. It was a cemetery, a small, forgotten, family burial ground for the original settlers of the land. It was located, according to my quick calculations against the modern grid, almost in the exact center of Richard Sterling's 100-acre parcel. It was located precisely where the architectural drawings, which I had found online on the developer's website, showed the location of his planned 15,000 square foot mega mansion. A cold, quiet thrill went through me. It wasn't the thrill of revenge, it was the thrill of a professional who has just solved a very, very complex problem. I had found the fundamental, hidden flaw in the system. Richard and Veronica had bought a beautiful piece of property, but they had failed to read the footnotes, and in my world, the footnotes are everything. Having the old map was a major breakthrough, but it wasn't enough. A hand-drawn map from the 1870s, no matter how compelling, could be challenged in court. It was a powerful piece of historical evidence, but I needed to connect it to the present with irrefutable, modern data. I needed to prove, with the certainty of modern science, that the graves were still there. This required fieldwork. The problem was, I couldn't just walk onto Richard's property with my equipment. That would be trespassing, and it would tip my hand. I needed a plausible reason to be near the boundary line. I spent an evening studying the satellite imagery and property records of the adjacent parcels. The land to the east of Richard's property was an old, overgrown apple orchard, owned by a man named George Peterson. No relation. I remembered my father mentioning him once. George was a gruff, old-school farmer who had resisted all offers from developers to sell his land. I looked up his number and gave him a call. I explained that I was a local surveyor conducting a historical research project on old farm boundaries in the area. It was a story that was mostly true. I asked if he would mind me taking some measurements along his western boundary, the one that abutted Richard's property. "You the fella doing the survey for that city slicker Sterling?" he grunted, his voice thick with suspicion. "No, sir," I said respectfully. "I'm an independent researcher. In fact, Mr. Sterling's development is part of what prompted my research. I'm trying to ensure the old boundary markers aren't lost." This was the right thing to say. George launched into a 10-minute tirade about developers, property taxes, and men who wear suits to look at dirt. "All right," he finally said. "You can come, but you stay on my side of the fence. I don't want that Sterling fella accusing me of anything." The next morning, I was there. George's orchard was a beautiful, wild place, a stark contrast to the manicured emptiness of Richard's land next door. I spent the first hour doing what I said I would do. I used my GPS rover and total station to locate the old iron pins and stone markers along the property line, documenting them meticulously. George watched me for a while from his porch. Then, apparently satisfied that I was a serious professional, he went back inside. This was my chance. I unpacked the rest of my equipment. The centerpiece was a ground-penetrating radar unit. A GPR looks like a futuristic lawnmower. You push it along the ground, and it sends radio waves into the earth. The waves bounce back differently depending on what they hit: rock, tree roots, compacted soil, or disturbed earth and voids. It creates a digital image of what lies beneath the surface. It is the perfect tool for finding things that are meant to stay hidden. I started my scans, running the GPR in a tight grid pattern along George's side of the fence. I wasn't on Richard's property, but the GPR could scan laterally for some distance. My target area was the gentle rise in the land, about 200 feet into Richard's parcel, where the old map indicated the cemetery should be. For an hour the screen showed nothing but the predictable stratigraphy of the local soil: topsoil, clay, bedrock. It was mundane, uniform. Then I saw it. A series of anomalies began to appear on my screen. They were regular, rectangular shapes, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. They were oriented in a neat east-west line, just as traditional burial practices would dictate. The soil inside these shapes was different, less compacted. It was the unmistakable signature of graves. My heart beat a little faster. It was one thing to see it on an old map. It was another thing entirely to see the digital ghosts of these long-dead people appearing on my screen. I counted them. 12.
Exactly as the old map had said, I saved the GPR data, running multiple scans to ensure I had a complete verifiable record. I had it, the historical document, and the modern scientific proof. It was a perfect, closed loop of evidence. A flashback came to me then. Leo, when he was 6, we were at the beach, and he was building an elaborate sandcastle. He had spent an hour on it, with towers and moats. Then a bigger kid had come along and kicked it down for no reason. Leo had looked at me, his face crumpled in despair. I hadn't yelled at the other kid. I had sat down with Leo in the sand. Okay, I'd said. Let's analyze the failure. The walls were too steep. The foundation was too dry. We can build it again, but this time, we build it stronger. We build it so the next bully can't knock it down. We had spent the rest of the afternoon building a new castle, a masterpiece of sand engineering, with reinforced walls and a deep, wide moat. This felt like that. Veronica and Richard had kicked over my sand castle, but I wasn't going to yell. I was going to analyze the failure, and I was going to rebuild on a foundation of solid, unshakable proof. The fortress I was building now wasn't made of sand. It was made of history, law, and ground-penetrating radar, and it was about to become their problem. With the historical records and the GPR data in hand, I had the technical case, but I needed to understand the full legal ramifications. Discovering an old cemetery on a piece of prime development land wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a legal bombshell. I needed a specialist, a lawyer who understood the arcane and complex world of land use law, historical preservation statutes, and most importantly, the legal status of abandoned burial grounds. I knew just the person. Her name was Clara Finn. She was a semi-retired lawyer in her late 60s, a woman who had spent her entire career fighting developers on behalf of small towns and historical societies. She was a legend in the field, a walking encyclopedia of zoning codes and preservation law. She had a reputation for being fiercely intelligent and utterly incorruptible. She had once famously described a developer's environmental impact report as a work of fiction so audacious it bordered on poetry. I had worked with her once, years ago, on a boundary dispute involving a historic property. She had respected my meticulous, detail-oriented work. I called her office, a small cluttered practice in a historic downtown building. I got her on the phone directly. "Clara, it's Ethan Hayes." "Ethan," she said, her voice warm but businesslike. "I haven't heard from you in years. I trust you're not calling to tell me another developer is trying to pave over a piece of history." "As a matter of fact, Clara," I said, "that's exactly why I'm calling." I laid out the situation for her. I didn't mention my ex-wife or my son. I framed it as a professional inquiry. I told her about the 100-acre parcel, the developer's plans, and the evidence I had uncovered, the 1870s plat map, and the modern GPR data, confirming the existence of a dozen unmarked graves. I sent her my encrypted file. While we were on the phone, there was a long silence. As she reviewed the documents, I could hear the faint clicking of her mouse. "Well, I'll be," she finally said, a note of grim satisfaction in her voice. "Ethan, you haven't just found a needle in a haystack. You found the legal equivalent of a tactical nuclear weapon." She then proceeded to give me a 15-minute impromptu masterclass on cemetery law. Under state law, she explained, the discovery of an unrecorded burial ground, especially one of this vintage, triggers a whole cascade of events. First, all work on the property must cease immediately. The State Historical Commission must be notified. The county coroner must be involved to confirm the remains are historical and not part of a modern crime scene. "What happens then?" I asked. "Then," she continued, "the site is immediately designated as a protected archaeological and historical resource. A process of genealogical research would begin to try and identify any living descendants of the people buried there. But regardless of whether they find any, the site itself is protected in perpetuity. It becomes illegal to disturb the grave. That means no digging, no foundations, no construction of any kind within a legally mandated buffer zone around the cemetery." "And the buffer zone?" I prompted. "For a site of this significance, it could be up to 100 feet in every direction," she said. "Your GPR data places the cemetery right in the middle of the parcel. A 100-foot buffer zone around it would make the most valuable, central part of the land completely undevelopable. It would effectively render the entire parcel worthless for the kind of single residence luxury development your Mr. Sterling has in mind. The legal trap was even more perfect than I had imagined. The land wasn't just compromised. It was, for Richard's purposes, nullified. So what are my obligations? I asked. Legally, as a professional surveyor who has discovered this, you have an ethical and, in some interpretations, a legal duty to report your findings to the State Historical Commission, she said. If you don't, and it's discovered later that you knew, you could face professional sanctions. She paused, but the timing of that report is a matter of professional discretion. I knew what she was giving me. She was giving me the weapon, fully loaded, and telling me I could choose when to pull the trigger. Clara, I said, I have a personal connection to this situation. The developer is the new husband of my ex-wife. She has barred me from attending my son's 10th birthday party this Saturday. I was planning on sending a gift. Clara was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different. It had lost its clinical, legal tone, and was now filled with a deep, human understanding. Ethan, she said slowly, a map is a beautiful gift for a young boy. A gift of history, of place, and a truly accurate map. One that shows all the important features of a piece of land, is the most valuable gift of all. I think you should send him the map. Let the map speak for itself. The formal report to the Historical Commission can wait until Monday morning. I had my legal confirmation, and I had my ally. My plan was no longer just a theory. It was a legally sound, professionally ethical, and devastatingly effective strategy. I thanked Clara for her time. Give 'em hell, Ethan, she said before hanging up. I spent the next 2 days in my workshop, a place of creation, but I was not restoring something old. I was creating something new, a piece of art that was also a piece of evidence, a gift that was also a judgment. The map was going to be my masterpiece.
The creation of the map was a ritual. It was a physical manifestation of my methodical, patient work, and it had to be perfect. I chose a large sheet of heavy, hot-press watercolor paper, its texture smooth and substantial. I mixed my own inks, blending sepia and black to create a color that looked both modern and timeless. I used my antique set of drafting tools, the ones I had inherited from my own grandfather, a man who had also been a surveyor. The tools felt warm and familiar in my hand, a connection to a legacy of honest, precise work. I began by drawing the boundary lines of the property, each line a testament to legal certainty. I used my GPS and GPR data to plot the topography, the gentle roll of the hills, the curve of the small stream that ran through the western edge. Each contour line was a work of patient artistry. I drew in the significant trees, the ancient oaks that had stood there for centuries, silent witnesses to the history buried beneath them. I used a fine-nibbed pen to add the details, a compass rose in the corner, a scale bar, a title block with elegant, hand-drawn calligraphy. The title read, A Cartographic Survey of the Sterling Family Estate, for Leo Hayes on his 10th birthday. It was a beautiful object, a map that any father would be proud to give his son. It was a Trojan horse. The final, most important detail was the cemetery. I drew the small square plot in the center of the map, exactly where the GPR data had placed it. I used a different color ink for its boundary, a subtle, dark red, the color of old, dried blood. Inside the boundary, I drew 12 small, simple crosses, and beneath the plot, in the same elegant script as the title, I wrote the label. The words were chosen with the same care as the lines on the map. They had to be clear, factual, and legally unambiguous. Pioneers Rest Cemetery. Unrecorded. Est. Circa 12 marked internments. Identified via GPR survey. Site protected. Under State Historical Preservation Code. 1 Coded T. Disturbance of unmarked human burial sites. All development and construction are legally restricted, pending State Historical Commission review. The words were a quiet, devastating summary of my discovery. They transformed the map from a piece of art into a legal document, a notice of violation, a stop work order. It was a declaration of truth, delivered in the calm, irrefutable language of my profession. A flashback to my wedding day, 20 years ago. My father-in-law, a man I had genuinely liked, had taken me aside. "Thomas is a good man," he'd said to me. He was referring to Veronica's first fiancé, a flashy stockbroker she'd left for me. "But you, Ethan," he had said, clapping me on the shoulder. "You are a solid man. You have a foundation. You'll take good care of my daughter." He had been wrong. I had taken care of her, but he had misunderstood her nature. He thought she wanted a foundation. I realized now, she had only wanted a penthouse. She had wanted the view without any interest in the structure that supported it. When the ink was dry, I had the map professionally framed. I chose a simple, dark wood frame that complemented the antique feel of the map. It looked magnificent. It looked important. It looked like something Richard Sterling, a man obsessed with the appearance of old money and legacy, would be compelled to show off. On Saturday morning, the day of the party, I carefully wrapped the large, framed map in plain brown paper. I wrote a simple card, "To Leo, happy 10th birthday. This is a map of your new home. A home should always be built on a solid foundation. Know the land. All my love, Dad." The message was a quiet echo of my long-dead father-in-law's words, a piece of advice I was passing on to my son, and a final, subtle warning to my ex-wife. I did not, as she had instructed, drop it off at the concierge desk. That was too impersonal. It would have been set aside with the other gifts, perhaps not even opened until the party was over. No, the delivery had to be part of the plan. It had to be an event. I hired a professional art courier service. I gave them specific instructions. The gift was to be delivered to the country club at exactly 4:00 p.m. in the middle of the party. The courier was to ask for Richard Sterling personally and state that they were delivering a large, fragile piece of art for him. It was a move designed to pique Richard's ego. A special delivery, just for him. It would make him feel important. It would ensure he opened it immediately, in front of his audience of wealthy friends and business associates. The plan was in motion. The gift was on its way. I spent the afternoon in my workshop, the silence a stark contrast to the noise and forced merriment of the party I was excluded from. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't angry. I was a surveyor who had planted a boundary marker in the ground, a marker made of iron and concrete and historical fact. All I had to do now was wait for them to run into it. The phone call came at 4. I was in my workshop, carefully sanding the leg of an antique chair, the rhythmic motion a form of meditation. The caller ID was a blocked number. I knew who it was. I let it ring 3 times. Then I answered, my voice calm and neutral. "Hello, Ethan." The voice on the other end was a screech of pure, undiluted rage. It was Veronica. The carefully curated mask of the graceful society wife had been incinerated, leaving only the raw fury underneath. "What did you do? What is this? You've ruined everything." Behind her, I could hear a cacophony of noise, the murmur of a crowd, Richard's voice, raised and panicked, yelling at someone. The party had clearly come to an abrupt, spectacular halt. "I'm not sure what you mean, Veronica," I said, my voice deliberately placid. "I sent Leo a birthday gift. I hope he liked it." "The map," she shrieked. "The goddamn map. Everyone saw it. Richard, this is a disaster. You did this on purpose. You're trying to ruin us." "I sent my son a map of his new home," I replied, my tone still even. "I am a cartographer. It is what I do. I believe in accuracy." "Is the map not accurate, Veronica?" There was a sputtering silence on the other end. She was caught. To admit the map was accurate was to admit the devastating truth it contained. To claim it was a lie was pointless, because the evidence was right there in elegant, damning script. I could picture the scene perfectly, the courier arriving, Richard, his chest puffed out, accepting the important delivery, the grand unveiling in front of his friends, the investors, the business partners, the sycophants, the initial admiration for the beautiful, impressive gift from the boring ex-husband, and then the slow dawning of horror as Richard's eyes focused on the label in the center of the map. The moment he understood that his multi-million-dollar legacy project, the foundation of his future wealth and status, was worthless. The moment he realized he had been publicly, humiliatingly, and completely outmaneuvered. Richard's lawyers are calling the county. Oh my God, this is a nightmare, she stammered, her rage giving way to a rising panic. He says the land is worthless. He says we're ruined. That sounds like a failure of due diligence on his part, I said calmly. A proper survey and title search should always include a review of the historical record. It's standard practice. I'm surprised his development company overlooked it. The subtext was clear. Your new, powerful, successful man is an incompetent amateur. He had failed at the most basic level of his own profession. The quiet, boring surveyor had done his homework. The flashy developer had not. That, I knew, would be the most painful cut of all for a man like Richard. I'm going to sue you, she hissed, her fury returning. I'm going to take you for everything you have. I don't think you will, Veronica, I said. Your lawyer will advise you against it. My findings are factual, and were discovered in the course of my professional research. As a licensed surveyor, I have a duty to report them to the state. In fact, my lawyer, Clara Finch, will be filing the official report with the State Historical Commission on Monday morning. Any attempt to sue me would be viewed by the court as a frivolous and retaliatory action. It would not go well for you. The mention of Clara Finch's name was the final devastating blow. Veronica knew who she was. Everyone in the world of property and development knew who she was. Bringing in Clara was like announcing you were bringing a tank to a knife fight. It was a signal that I was not just right, I was prepared. The fight went out of her. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Why, Ethan? Why would you do this to me? You seem to be confused, Veronica, I said. And for the first time, I let a hint of the cold anger I felt seep into my voice. You seem to think this was about you. It wasn't. You barred me from my son's life. You and your new husband tried to erase me. You showed me, with absolute clarity, that you have no respect for boundaries. My entire life, my entire profession is about the importance of boundaries. The physical, the legal, and the personal. This wasn't an attack. It was a restoration. I simply redrew a boundary that you, in your arrogance, had overlooked. The consequences of where that line falls are your problem, not mine. I didn't wait for a reply. I hung up the phone. I stood in the silence of my workshop, the scent of sawdust in the air. The rage I had suppressed was gone. The hurt had subsided. In its place was a profound, quiet sense of order restored. The storm I had unleashed would rage for weeks, even months, but my work was done. The boundary marker was in the ground, and it would not be moved. The fallout from the party was, from what I gathered, spectacular. Richard Sterling's public humiliation was the talk of the town. His young investor party had turned into a real-time lesson in what happens when a high-risk asset portfolio collapses. His investors and partners, who had been in attendance, were not amused. The State Historical Commission, acting on the report from Clara Finch, immediately issued a stop work order on the property. The county coroner's office confirmed the presence of the graves, and the land was officially designated a protected historical site. Richard's multi-million-dollar investment was now a legally mandated nature preserve. He tried to sue the holding company he had bought the land from, but their lawyers pointed to the fine print in the sale agreement. The buyer was responsible for all due diligence. He had been so eager to close the deal that he had relied on a superficial, modern survey and had waived the deeper historical title search. His arrogance had been his downfall. The financial strain and the public shame were a toxic combination for a relationship built on the flimsy foundations of wealth and status. Within 6 months, Veronica and Richard had separated. Her dream of a life as a development titan's wife had ended in a cloud of dust and legal fees. She had traded a solid, if quiet life with me for a flashy, high-risk venture with him, and the venture had gone bust. I felt no satisfaction in her ruin, only a distant, clinical sense